The Passover Haggadah, its complex structure and obscure origins, have perplexed scholars for centuries. Even the identity of its author has long been a mystery. Until now. Presented by Seder Educational Media, Mysteries of the Haggadah. This episode, Moses at the Seder. Seder night is a time for questions, and one surprisingly persistent question has been a Passover standard for centuries. Why isn't Moses mentioned in the Haggadah? But is that even so? And if not, why do we keep asking about him? To find a satisfactory answer, we need to take a deep dive into the history and hidden meaning of the Haggadah. When modern commentaries ask about the absence of Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher, they usually spend as much time justifying the question as trying to answer it. Because Moshe is mentioned once in the Haggadah, though you might have missed it. Following the enumeration of the 10 plagues, the Haggadah quotes from the sage Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, who cites two biblical verses to demonstrate that the punishments inflicted on the pursuing Egyptian army at the Red Sea were 5 times worse than the 10 plagues that befell Egypt. He made this seemingly simple calculation by comparing one plague in Egypt, described as the finger of God, to the divine revelation at the splitting of the sea, called the Great Hand. The latter verse reads, "Israel saw the great hand that God used against Egypt, and the nation feared God, and they believed in God, and in Moses his servant." One might argue that this verse is not part of the Haggadah's main narrative, or that it only mentions Moshe in passing, but that's a strained reading, because it's easy to be distracted by Rabbi Yossi's calculation and forget the more straightforward reason for the inclusion of this verse. It recounts the aftermath of the sea splitting, the very climax of the story, not only in the Haggadah, but in the Torah itself. In fact, this verse is also the very last verse in the Torah describing Israel's escape from Egypt. From there, they enter the wilderness. The verse also marks a high point of Moshe's leadership and a moment of personal triumph when the nation finally recognized Moshe as God's true servant. And what greater praise is there than to be called a servant of God, mentioned in the same breath as the divine name? So if the finale of the Exodus story in the Haggadah comes with high praise of Moshe, why are we so worried that he was left out? To understand that, we need to look back at the Haggadah's historical development. The original instructions for the Passover Seder are recorded in the Mishnah, the ancient collection of Jewish law compiled in the 2nd century CE. The Mishnah directs us to retell the Exodus on Passover night by expounding verses from the Torah called the Declaration of the First Fruits. The traditional exposition of these verses is found in another work contemporary to the Mishnah called the Sifri. And the earliest written Haggadahs consisted of little more than the exposition of the Sifri inserted into the Mishnah's succinct instructions. These simple Haggadahs were later expanded to include more sections, until finally, the version we use today was composed by a mysterious figure called the Baal Haggadah, or Master of the Haggadah. The Baal Haggadah's version is significantly more elaborate, with several important additions, including the section of Rabbi Yossi that mentions Moshe Rabbeinu. But older Haggadahs did not mention Moshe, so it was more appropriate to ask about his absence in earlier times. However, even then, the question was not merely about Moshe's omission. The question was actually directed at the Haggadah's most prominent message. The key passage from the Sifri declares, "God took us out of Egypt, not by the hand of an angel, not by the hand of a seraph, not by the hand of a messenger, but the Holy One, blessed is He alone, in His glory." Simply put, the Sifri's message is one of unconditional monotheism. God alone freed us from Egypt. But this formula is not entirely uncontroversial, as we see by comparing the Sifri's language to the words of the Torah itself. In the final verses of the book of Deuteronomy, the Torah eulogizes Moshe Rabbeinu thus, "No prophet came again to Israel like Moses, who knew God face to face, for all the signs and wonders that God sent him to perform in the land of Egypt, and all the strong hand and great awe that Moses performed in the eyes of Israel." This contrast drives home the salience of Moshe's absence from earlier versions of the Haggadah, and the staying power of a question that has now been repeated at Seder tables for more than 1,000 years, even as the question itself seemed to be undermined by the Haggadah's preeminent editor. But if the Haggadah's original source meant to minimize Moshe's role, what prompted the Baal Haggadah to change the script? Did he mean to challenge the Sifri? On the contrary, we find that he positioned this passage at the very center of our Haggadah and expanded it to contain exactly 72 words. The seeming conflict between the Sifri's forceful message and the praise of Moshe in our Haggadah is one reason some modern historians claim that Moshe has been included in error. According to them, because Moshe isn't necessary for Rabbi Yossi's calculation, the verse was meant to be cut short before mentioning Moshe. That's a simple solution to the problem, especially if we assume the Haggadah is a simple document. Goodbye hard questions, goodbye complexity, goodbye Moshe. But what did the Baal Haggadah intend? On closer inspection, we find that the Haggadah is full of hidden allusions to Moshe Rabbeinu. For example, the opening paragraph of Avadim Hayinu contains exactly 54 words, and 54 is the numeric value of mate, staff. Elsewhere, the Haggadah cites a verse about Moshe's staff. It says, "Take this staff in your hand, with which you will perform the signs." The Hebrew word ot, sign, also means letter, and based on this, an ancient tradition explains that Moshe's staff was engraved with letters, specifically 10 letters representing the 10 plagues. Datsach, Adash, Bahav. Therefore, the Baal Haggadah edited the 54-word paragraph of Avadim Hayinu so that it too is inscribed with these signs. He did this in a remarkable way. The first group of 3 letters, Datsach, are separated by intervals of 14, the numeric value of hand, and placed at the center of the paragraph. The second group, Adash, are also equidistant, but they encompass the entire paragraph, from the first to the last word, centered on the same letter Daled in Datsach. The last group of 4 letters began after the 50th letter in the paragraph, separated by intervals of 50 letters. But because the last letter, Bet, signifies the plague of the firstborn, which stands apart from the others, it is at an interval of 100 letters, extending into the next paragraph. The sum of these intervals is 250, the number of plagues at the sea mentioned in the Haggadah according to Rabbi Akiva. Or if we ignore the first 50, the sum is 200, the number according to Rabbi Eliezer. What's more, as explained in a later episode, the Baal Haggadah also composed another version of Avadim Hayinu that instead references the heavenly manna that fed the Israelites in the wilderness, manna which tradition says fell in the merit of Moshe Rabbeinu. Both versions of the paragraph exist in printed Haggadahs today, and both allude to Moshe Rabbeinu. And here's more direct evidence that the Baal Haggadah meant to include Moshe. Careful inspection demonstrates that he also edited the paragraph of Rabbi Yossi to contain exactly 260 letters, or 10 times the value of the Tetragrammaton, God's 4-letter name. Not a coincidence following directly after the enumeration of the 10 plagues. It also contains exactly 66 words, which equals Hayad Hagadolah, the great hand, the major theme of the passage. And these 66 words combine ingeniously with adjacent sections to make further amazing allusions. The following paragraphs of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva contain 50 and 54 words, significant numbers that combine to make 104, 4 times the Tetragrammaton, and the value of B'damai Chayi. These 2 sections combine with the next section, the song Dayenu, containing 144 words, to make 248, the value of Avraham, our first patriarch, and 248 combines with the 66 words of Rabbi Yossi's section to make 314, Shin Daled Yud, the 3-letter name by which God revealed himself to the patriarchs. The reprise of Dayenu contains 5 times 13 words, and the following section of Rabban Gamliel until the end of Maggid contains 18 times 13 words. So in total, these sections contain 299 words, and 299 plus 314 equals 613, the number of commandments in the Torah. This block of 613 is also one of a pair, 2 blocks that encompass most of the Maggid section of the Haggadah. Together, these 2 blocks of 613 allude to the 2 tablets of the law carried down from Mount Sinai by Moshe Rabbeinu. However, all of this comes crashing down if the section of Rabbi Yossi doesn't contain exactly 66 words. And it cannot unless it quotes the verse about Moshe in its entirety. In other words, everything relies on Moshe Rabbeinu. But now that we've confirmed that the Haggadah's composer fully intended to include Moshe at the very climax of the Exodus story, what justified this break from tradition? That has to do with another major theme of our modern Seder, exile. Because the Haggadah is not a mere storybook, it is also a fervent plea to the divine. The book of Exodus records that after witnessing the golden calf and smashing the first 2 tablets, Moshe returned to Mount Sinai to beg mercy for his people. And in a selfless act of brinksmanship, he made this astonishing request from God. Now, if you would, forgive their sin, and if not, please erase me from your book. For centuries, many have assumed that Moshe Rabbeinu had been effectively erased from one of Judaism's most important books, the Passover Haggadah. But as we see, it isn't so simple. On a night when we peer out into a dark world and plead, next year in Jerusalem, the Baal Haggadah knew we need everyone at the table. But who was this mysterious man? An author with the conviction and the authority to reintroduce Moshe after his long conspicuous absence. A Moses figure in his own time, among the greatest scholars in Jewish history, unappreciated by his contemporaries, exiled from his birthplace, yet endowed with seemingly superhuman humility. For over 1,000 years, he has awaited recognition. Coming soon. Please show your support by clicking subscribe and visit us at PesachHaggadah.org.